Welcome to Life Stories, where we share real, raw, and inspiring journeys of resilience, triumph, and self-discovery. Today's story is one of pain, perseverance, and ultimately, empowerment. It's about a young woman who, despite the hardships life threw her way, found the strength to rise above and build a future on her own terms. Her journey isn't just a testament to survival, it's a lesson in forgiveness, strength, and self-love. So, sit back, relax, and join us as we dive into today's life story. Don't forget to subscribe to stay updated with more incredible tales of human strength and courage. I still remember the day my life changed forever. I was only 6, but I can still feel the weight of that morning in my bones. It was the day my mother passed away. It wasn't just the loss of her that shook my world, it was everything that followed. My father, once a pillar of strength and love, seemed to crumble right before my eyes. He was lost, consumed by grief, and in the fog of his mourning, I saw him drift away from me, more and more every day. Before my mother's death, our home had been full of warmth. My mother's laugh was the soundtrack to our days, and my father's gentle presence gave me a sense of safety. But when she died, it was as if the light in our home went out. My father, once so present and caring, withdrew. He stopped talking about my mother, and he stopped looking at me the way he used to. His eyes, once full of life, now carried a heaviness I couldn't quite understand. It wasn't long after her death that my father met Laura. At first, I thought nothing of it. He was lonely, and I could see the small flicker of hope in his eyes whenever he spoke of her. But the moment she moved in, things began to shift. The house that had once felt like home started to feel foreign. It wasn't just the new woman in my father's life that caused this. It was everything about Laura that slowly erased the memory of my mother. Her photos began to replace my mother's on the mantle. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. Or maybe my father was trying to move on. But as the days passed, it became clear. My mother was slowly being erased from our lives. Laura wasn't just a replacement for my mother, she was pushing her out of the picture entirely. I was introduced to her as my new mother. And though I couldn't bring myself to call her that, I felt the weight of the expectation. Laura wasn't kind, nor was she understanding. She was stern, strict, and had an unyielding way about her that made me feel like a burden in my own home. I remember how she would scold me for the smallest things. My hair wasn't combed right. I hadn't cleaned my room to her standards. Or I hadn't finished my chores exactly when she told me to. Every day, it felt like I was falling short, never measuring up to the kind of daughter she wanted me to be. My father, always distant, never stood up for me. I could see that he was changing too, becoming more and more absorbed in Laura's world. His silence was deafening. It wasn't long before I found myself standing in the shadow of Laura's pregnancy. The joy my father expressed at the idea of a new child felt like a slap in the face to me. I couldn't help but feel that I was becoming invisible in my own family. The new baby, a little girl named Madison, would take center stage in the family, while I was left behind. Laura made it clear that Madison would be the one she focused on, showering her with attention and affection, while I remained a ghost in the background, just trying to survive in a home that no longer felt like mine. It was hard not to feel betrayed, especially by my father. I had once been the center of his world, his little girl, the one he cherished above all. But now, it seemed as if all of that had been replaced. And what hurt the most was that I was expected to accept it. I had to accept that my mother was gone, that my father was no longer the man he had been, and that Laura and her child were now the new family I had to make room for. There were moments when I would retreat to my room and cry, wishing for things to go back to the way they had been, when my mother was alive, and when my father's eyes were full of love for me. But that was a dream that seemed so far away now. I had no choice but to adapt, to navigate this new world where I was no longer the daughter who mattered. And then came the realization that my father wasn't just distant, he was completely gone. He was so wrapped up in his new family that he couldn't see how lost I had become. How abandoned I felt. I remember standing in the kitchen one day, trying to wash dishes while Laura barked orders at me, her sharp voice cutting through the silence like a knife. I wanted to scream, to tell her that I wasn't just some servant in her home, But all I could do was nod and keep working. Because no matter how much I wanted to fight back, it felt like I was fighting a battle I was destined to lose. In those moments, when I felt the most alone, I tried to hold on to the memory of my mother. I held on to the way she made me feel, the way she'd comfort me after a long day, and the warmth of her embrace. That was the only thing that kept me going, the belief that somehow, even though she was gone, a part of her would always be with me. But I also knew, deep down, that the life I had known, the family I had once cherished, was slipping further and further away from me. And so, I began to navigate a new world, one that didn't seem to have a place for me anymore. The world of Laura and Madison was a world that pushed me aside, where I felt invisible and unwanted. Yet, somehow, I kept moving forward. I had no choice. Life, as it often does, had forced me to adapt to a new reality. But I wasn't ready to give up just yet. I may have felt lost. I may have felt abandoned. But deep down, I knew that there was still more to my story. And as much as it hurt to admit it, I was beginning to understand that the road ahead was going to be a lot harder than I had ever imagined. As I grew older, the weight of my new life seemed to grow heavier with each passing year. What once felt like a temporary discomfort in my home slowly transformed into a permanent tension. One that I couldn't ignore, no matter how hard I tried. Laura's presence, her ever-watchful eyes, and her constant reminders of what I wasn't doing right became the soundtrack of my daily life. The resentment and distance between us only deepened, and as much as I tried to keep my head down, I knew things were getting worse. When I was around 12, Madison was born, and the shift in the family dynamic became undeniable. The household that had once been divided in its attention, between my father, me, and the memory of my mother, now had another focus. Madison was adored, showered with affection, and treated like a princess. I was expected to look after her, to care for her like a second mother. But I could see that I wasn't included in the circle of love that surrounded her. It wasn't just that I was asked to care for my little sister. It was the way that Laura treated me while praising Madison for every little thing she did. My own efforts, no matter how hard I worked, were never enough to earn Laura's approval. Madison would get the praise, the hugs, the attention. I would get the harsh words and the reminders of everything I hadn't done, everything I had failed to do. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was nothing more than a servant in my own home. The emotional toll this took on me was overwhelming. The days blurred together, one long string of exhaustion, frustration, and hurt. I found myself questioning my worth, my value not just in the eyes of Laura and my father, but in my own eyes as well. Every time I looked into the mirror, I saw the girl who wasn't good enough, who wasn't loved the way she needed to be loved. I began to believe the story they had written for me, the daughter who was invisible, who wasn't deserving of anything better. It was during these years that I began to find comfort in the small, quiet moments I could steal away from myself. My escape was the few hours I spent at my grandmother's house. There, I felt the warmth and the love I had once known, the love I hadn't felt in my own home for what felt like a lifetime. My grandmother treated me like I was precious, like I still had value, like I was worthy of being loved without conditions. Her house was a sanctuary, a place where I could remember what it was like to feel truly loved. But, like everything good in my life, the peace I found there was fleeting. It wasn't long before Laura began to grow suspicious of my trips to my grandmother's house. She didn't like that I was getting love and support somewhere outside of her reach. And one day, it all came crashing down. My grandmother, who had never minced words, made a comment about Laura's harsh parenting. It wasn't cruel, but it was honest, and Laura couldn't stand it. She told my father that I wasn't allowed to see my grandmother anymore. That was the moment that broke me. I remember sitting in the car, trying not to cry, as we drove home after that conversation. I wanted to scream, to beg my father to see me, to see that I wasn't just some child he could push aside. But his silence was deafening. He said nothing, his eyes on the road. And in that moment, I felt more alone than I had ever felt in my life. Not being able to see my grandmother was like losing the last thread of sanity I had left. My home had never felt more suffocating, more foreign. I was trapped in a house where I wasn't wanted, where I wasn't loved, My only solace was school, where I could escape the oppressive atmosphere of home and lose myself in books and work. But even then, the loneliness followed me. There was no way to escape the feeling that I was falling apart. Bit by bit, day after day. It was a cruel irony, how my family, the very people who should have supported me, were the ones who tore me down the most. I tried to find a way to rise above it, to be the person I wanted to be. But it was hard when the people who were supposed to care for you only made you feel less than. And yet, in the midst of it all, I started to feel something stirring inside me, something that told me this wasn't the end of my story. But I couldn't deny the ache in my chest every time I looked at Madison and saw how effortlessly she fit into the family. How easily she was loved. Every time Laura smiled at her, praised her, doted on her, it reminded me of everything I didn't have, everything I wasn't, the jealousy, the resentment, it all boiled over inside me. I hated myself for feeling that way. I hated myself for not being strong enough to just accept it. But how could I? As I sat in my room, sometimes listening to the laughter coming from downstairs, Laura and my father's voices, mixed with Madison's happy giggles, I knew one thing. I had to find a way out. I had to find a way to escape this feeling of drowning in a family that no longer felt like mine. In the silence of my room, I made a promise to myself. One day, I would find my way out. I would make something of myself. Something that couldn't be taken away. Something that would prove to Laura and my father that I wasn't invisible. That I wasn't worthless. And though I couldn't yet see how it would all unfold, deep down, I knew that I had to keep going. This chapter of my life wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. As the years passed, I began to realize that my only chance for a better future lay in my ability to rise above the pain. To escape the prison my family had become. And to carve out a path of my own. I was tired of feeling like a ghost in my own life. Forgotten and neglected. It was clear to me now that I wasn't going to get the love I so desperately craved from my family. But there was something stronger. Something more resilient growing inside me. A fire that would not go out. No matter how much life tried to snuff it out. It all came to a head when I turned 18. I had been working part-time at a local cafe for a while. Just trying to get by. The hours were long, the work grueling, but it gave me a small sense of independence. A feeling that I wasn't entirely at the mercy of my family. I had been saving every penny I could. Squirreling away money in secret. Knowing that someday, I would need it, and that day arrived sooner than I expected. One night, my father, who had been growing more distant with each passing year, told me to pack my things. No explanation, no discussion, just a simple command. Laura stood by his side. Her expression unreadable, but I could see the satisfaction in her eyes. It was clear that she had orchestrated this moment. And I had no choice but to comply. I don't think they ever thought I would leave. But I did, with nothing more than a duffel bag and a heart full of anger and fear. I walked out of that house and into the unknown. The first night I spent outside my family's house was a blur of emotions, relief, fear, and overwhelming uncertainty. I had nowhere to go. No family to turn to. But I refused to let that stop me. I found a cheap, run-down apartment in a neighborhood that wasn't exactly safe. But it was a roof over my head. The isolation I had felt all these years was now amplified. I had no one, no family, no support system. But that was fine. I was used to it by now. I was my only ally. The next few months were a blur of survival. I worked long hours at the cafe. Sometimes pulling double shifts. Barely making enough to cover rent and basic expenses. But I kept going. Kept pushing forward. Knowing that every day was a step closer to something better. I wasn't sure what that better future would look like. But I knew I had to keep going. Then one day, as if by fate, my grandmother, my constant source of love and support, stepped in. She had heard about what happened. About how I had been cast out of my home. And despite Laura's best efforts to keep me from seeing her, my grandmother wouldn't be kept away. She gave me a small amount of money to help with rent and told me that I should consider going to college. "You're smart, Emma, and you've got a fire in you. Don't let this be the end of your story. You deserve more." Her words were like a spark that reignited something deep inside me. It was the first time in years that I had felt like I mattered. Like I had value. Laura had never seen that in me. And my father had always been too lost in his grief to notice. But my grandmother saw something I didn't even see in myself. She saw a future for me. So, I made a decision. I would go to college. I would take whatever opportunities came my way. And I would never look back. But there was one problem. My family still didn't know. I couldn't bear the thought of telling Laura and my father that I was going to college without their permission. The thought of Laura's disapproval was too much to handle. And the idea of facing my father's silence again was terrifying. But that didn't stop me. I enrolled in a community college. Keeping it a secret from them. I told them nothing. Focused solely on getting through my classes. And worked even harder at the cafe to cover my expenses. There were days when I would come home exhausted. Too tired to even eat. But I knew that I was building something for myself. Something that no one could take away. And over time, my hard work paid off. Years passed. And I worked my way up in the restaurant industry. I wasn't just a waitress anymore. I became a manager. Then a supervisor. And eventually, I saved enough to open my own small business. The sense of accomplishment I felt the day I signed the lease for my own restaurant was indescribable. I had made it. I had done it on my own. Without the help of a family that never believed in me. But success wasn't just about the restaurant or the money. It was about the freedom I had fought for. It was about reclaiming my life. My independence. And my identity. I was no longer the invisible girl living in the shadow of my family's cruelty. I was someone who had built herself from the ground up. Someone who had found a way to stand tall in a world that had tried to knock her down. And so, I kept pushing forward. I kept building. Kept striving for more. Knowing that I had already achieved the one thing that mattered most. My own happiness. My own sense of self-worth. I had come so far. And I wasn't going to stop now. As I sit here today, reflecting on everything I've been through, I realize that the journey was never just about escaping my past. It was about discovering who I truly am. The wounds of the past may never fully heal, but they no longer define me. I'm stronger because of them. My story is not just one of survival, but of triumph over adversity, of taking control of my destiny and shaping my own future. The restaurant I built is not just a business. It's a symbol of everything I've overcome. It's a place where I've found peace. And it's also where I've learned to forgive. Not just others, but myself. I may never get the love I wanted from my family. But I've learned to love myself. Something I never thought possible back then. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. No matter how hard life gets. No matter how alone you feel. You are capable of rising above it all. The power to change your life is within you. Keep fighting, keep believing in yourself, and keep moving forward, because at the end of the day, your story is yours to write. Thank you for listening to my story. If you found even a bit of strength or inspiration in it, please consider subscribing to the channel to hear more life stories. Don't miss out on the next chapter. You never know, your story might be the next one to inspire someone else.